off all by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat, and I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time. Top Gun was really a thrill. I must have done well in actual combat because at the time I was just a lieutenant junior grade, which is a first lieutenant in the Air Force. And so I may have been the very first lieutenant junior grade to go through Top Gun. That was the dream of a lifetime come true. I had wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot just like my dad from the time I was 10 years old. STS-27 was my third launch, and it was only the second launch after the Challenger accident. We were a top secret, classified Department of Defense mission, so to this day, if I told you what we carried, you could never leave this hangar. You'd be... Well, I will never forget. We maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are gonna die. To be an airline pilot, there was mandatory age 60 retirement. I was a NASA astronaut until I was 50 years old. And so I looked at the situation, and I had known a number of Southwest airline pilots. And they were just like me. They were flying because they loved to fly. Well, there's a lot of piloting that goes into it, a tremendous amount of piloting that goes into it, because you're going to wind up passing other airplanes. You're going to get in a duel with another airplane that's fairly closely matched. So there's a ton of satisfaction from doing that. And hey, let's just talk about the racing itself. It's fun to fly low, but it's dangerous. And so the only time I fly low is at the Reno air races. But watching the ground go by you at 400 and 500 miles an hour is pretty darn thrilling, because it's really scooting on by. And that's fun. That's really fun. I had always been fascinated by racing planes because they're sleek, streamlined, and they go real fast. There's that need for speed again, and they're raced around a pylon. And so I determined that I could break the existing altitude record for altitude and horizontal flight for that category of airplane. And in fact, I did that in 1991. And I'm fond of saying that if I have done well as an aviator, it's because my dad was the one who taught me how to fly. And he didn't just teach me how to fly, he taught me the why of it as well. He taught me the aerodynamics behind it, the reasons that you're doing things, not just how to do it, but why you're doing it is also very important.
was assigned to the ferry command set up at Dallas, Texas. And when I got to Dallas, I was reassigned to the Douglas plant at Tulsa, Oklahoma as a ferry control officer. My job was to turn the paperwork over to the incoming crews. In some respects, it was pretty good because some of the pretty young ladies were flying airplanes. I was supposed to test up a B-24. I went out to the airplane and was making a walk around, and this young lady came up on a bicycle. And she said, I want to fly in a big airplane. I'm taking flying lessons to be a WASP at Spartan, which was across the field. And I said, well, you can't do that because we can't take people on test ops. Besides, there's no parachute. I got in the airplane and the co-pilot came, and so did the crew chief. So we fired up and took off. At about 12,000 feet, who came up into the cockpit area but this young lady. So we had to scrub the mission. And we got on the ground, and I was filling out the form on, and the co-pilot took out a match cover thing, says, here, gave it to her, and said, put your telephone number on here. She did, wrote it out, and gave it to me.
It was a typically beautiful Honolulu morning, Sunday, December 7, 1941. Some were on their way to church, others sleeping off Saturday night fun, while the military and civilians enjoyed their quiet, comfortable, complacent dawn. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming to within flying range of Pearl Harbor and Ford Field. At exactly 7:48 a.m., the first of 353 Japanese planes started dropping bombs on the bulk of our country's Pacific Fleet, which was mostly lined up, tied up, still in the water, in the tiny harbor, sitting ducks. 9 minutes later, at 7:57 that awful morning, a radio message crackled across the island. Quote, air raid, Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill. In the stunning 2-hour surprise attack by Japanese aircraft and submarines, 18 ships were sunk or damaged. Most of nearly 300 Navy, Marine, and Air Corps planes were decimated where they sat on tarmacs. Only a handful of American military aircraft got off the ground. 29 Japanese planes were shot down that morning. More than 2,400 of our Marines, sailors, soldiers, and civilians died. Nearly 1,200 were wounded. The world would never be the same. In a speech to Congress and the country the next day, President Roosevelt, declaring war on Japan, referred to the previous day of the attack, quote, a date that will live in infamy.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese fleet commander who masterminded the attack, said, quote, I fear all we have done today is to awaken a great sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve, unquote. Little did he know. Fortunately, 75 years later, our countries are friends. The Japanese attack was intended to not only destroy much of our Pacific Fleet, but our morale as well. Roosevelt responded by pressing our military leaders to strike the Japanese homeland as soon as possible to send a message that attacking America was a big mistake. On April 18, 1942, just 4 months later, 80 American airmen, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, in 16 B-25 medium bombers, successfully attacked many targets in Japan. And good morning, everybody. I'm David Hartman. What a pleasure it is this morning to have with us Dick Cole, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, who sat in the right seat on that airplane you just saw leave the deck of the Hornet. Dick, good morning. It's great to have you back with us today here in Oshkosh.
Thank you.
And also joining us, Jimmy Doolittle's granddaughter, who is Jonna Doolittle Hoppus, who's written a wonderful biography of her grandparents, about her grandparents, and Jimmy Doolittle III, who is an Air Force retired colonel, 30 years active duty in the Air Force, 200 missions in Sky Raiders in Vietnam, test pilot for many, many years, former commandant of the test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base. And it's good to have you both with us, Jonna. Jim, good morning. Dick, welcome back to Oshkosh. There you were with the 17th Bomb Group up in Pendleton, Oregon, after President Roosevelt said that we should bomb Japan as soon as possible. He gave that directive only 3 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
There you were in the bomb group up in Pendleton, Oregon, and you got new orders. What were those new orders that came through in Pendleton for your bomb group?
Well, it wasn't exactly at Pendleton. It was 2 days at sea where the PA system came on. And we all assumed it was Admiral Halsey. But it said, now hear this, now hear this. This task force is bound for Tokyo.
My gosh. Now, you were transferred back to the East Coast with your bomb group. How did you learn about that?
We were at March Field over the weekend, the 5th to the 7th. And when we got orders to go back to Pendleton, we all took off about 4 o'clock in the morning and went back to Pendleton and changed some of the bomb shackles and so forth and put in anti-submarine bombs. And the next couple of days we went to Everett, Washington, Portland, Seattle, and went on sub-patrol duty. And it happened that one of our pilots, Brick Holstrom, sunk a Japanese submarine in the Straits of Wanda Fuka.
So when did the bomb group get orders to go back to the East Coast instead of staying on the West Coast?
It was around Valentine's Day, and we were got orders that we were going to Columbia. Yeah.
So when you went back, how much did you know about what was going to happen when you got back to the East Coast when you went to South Carolina with the group?
Well, the scuttlebutt was that we were going to Columbia, train for a while, and go to Africa. And at that time, they put out the word about looking for volunteers to go on a dangerous mission.
So you did receive the word that it was a dangerous mission.
Yes, sir.
Right? Were you given any thought at the time where you said you don't have to volunteer for this mission if you don't want to?
No, but just those words triggered the whole group, and the group commander even volunteered, the whole group.
So nobody quit?
No.
Nobody quit. So what happened then? You went down to Eglin, what's now Eglin Air Force Base.
We went to Eglin and set up the routine. And
Now, what was the routine? How much did you know at this point about what you were going to do?
well, when we got to Eglin and we were told about taking off from a carrier, all the Army pilots said, they didn't believe it. And I have to admit I was one of them.
Now, who was Lieutenant Henry Miller, a naval aviator, Lieutenant Miller? Who was he and what did he do?
Henry came, and he had never seen a B-25 before, but he was a real good instructor pilot. He taught the Army pilots how to put the compression on the steering wheel to where it was at the zero angle of attack, the least line of resistance. And he did a very good job. He rode with all of them.
So at this point, how much did you know about what the mission was going to be? Did you know at that time that you were going to fly to Japan?
Like I repeated what...
Did you know you were going to go to Japan?
No.
From Eglin? No.
Most of us in conjecture thought that we were going to be taken to some island and fight the war, take off and fight the war. And it wasn't until 2 days at sea that Admiral Halsey.
What modifications were done to the B-25s to make them lighter so you could fly off the carrier?
Well, since we were going low level, they took out the northern bomb sight and the lower turret, and put in a 75-gallon gas tank in that hole. They put a bladder tank on top of the bombs, and then they put another bladder tank on top of the only way you could get to the rear in the B-25, on top of the bomb container area. And they put 10 5-gallon cans of gasoline in the back where Paul Leonard could chop a hole in one of them and dump it into the gas tank to use it up. And after that, we threw out the cans, but the hole was to put the so to sink and it wouldn't leave a trail.
When did you learn that you were going to be Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot? And how did you find that out?
The pilot that I was assigned with became ill, and the day that Colonel Doolittle came in from wherever, I don't know where he came from, but he came in, and it was around 11 o'clock in the morning time. In the meantime, we had learned, the crew-wise, that my pilot had become ill and wasn't going to be able to go on the trip. So the crew talked it over, and I went to see Ski York, who was the operations officer, and told him that we still wanted to go. And he said, well, the old man is coming in this afternoon. We'll crew you up with him, and if you do okay, you got yourself a pilot. And that was all done in about an hour's time. And all Colonel Doolittle did was to take his seat.
What was your reaction when you learned that you were going to be co-pilot to Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle?
Well, as a young kid, I had a scrapbook of all the pilots that came into McCook Field at Dayton, Ohio. And he was in that scrapbook, so I knew who he was, but I'd never met him.
But what was it like for you to realize that you were flying with Jimmy Doolittle?
To put it broadly, I would say I was in a state of awe the whole time.
How did you get over that? Because you had work to do.
Follow the leader.
How secret was all of this?
I think it was one of the best kept secrets of the whole war. We were not allowed to go off base at Eglin, and we lived in barracks where there were, Eglin is one of the, well, I guess it was the biggest air base at that time, but it wasn't very well populated.
So, Jonna, how difficult was it for all that to be kept secret?
The orders were that absolutely no one was to know about it. There were a couple of crew members that knew because they went to research in Washington, the destinations in Tokyo, but it was highly kept. It was not even the White House knew what the mission was.
Wow, how difficult was it to keep that a secret? And I wonder how worried they were that it would leak out.
Probably pretty worried. But one of the interesting things was Tom Griffin was one of the guys who went to Washington to investigate where they were going to go and pull up maps. And security was a lock on the door.
Oh my gosh. Dick, so you left Eglin and went back to Sacramento, to McClellan Airfield in California. Did they do further modifications on the B-25s there in California?
We didn't want them to, because we had the tech reps there at Eglin, and they had done everything they needed to do to the carburetor for fuel consumption. And there really wasn't, the only thing that caused that thing in Sacramento was that when you went into a transit, into a base, they had a mechanics crew ready in case there was some kind of a problem. And they had instructions to start the engines up in the morning. And that's what they did. And they discovered that the correction, which they had never seen before, I guess. And so they tried to change it. And this is where Colonel Doolittle got a little hot under the collar.
So the mechanics were messing up your airplanes, yes? The mechanics were messing up your airplanes.
Well, yes, but they just didn't get the word.
Until Colonel Doolittle told them what was going on. So you moved back down to San Francisco, and the planes are loaded onto the Hornet, right?
Right.
Did you know yet that you were going to bomb Japan?
No.
So what was the scuttlebutt, though? I mean, the talk amongst all of you, and also,
another odd thing was that while we were at Alameda, Admiral Halsey loaned us his gig, and Colonel Peck gave us the word that we could go to San Francisco, be back by 8 o'clock Sunday morning. We went to on the gig, and almost all of us went to the top of the mark. And you could sit there and look across the bay and see this B-25 on the top of the deck. So if the Japanese had any spies, I don't know whether they noticed it or not.
Did anybody that night say anything to any of you about the fact that those planes were on the aircraft carrier?
No.
No? But Jonna, do you recall anything like that? They got away with it? They got away with going to the...
They got away with
Yeah.
it. One of the stories I understood is the Navy thought they were just ferrying their first maiden voyage, and they were just going to ferry these Army planes to one of the islands. So the Navy didn't know what they were doing either.
So you sail out into the Pacific.
Yeah, as far as we knew, we sailed out breach-free with the whole thing.
Right. So you get out. When did they tell you on board the Hornet?
2 days at sea, the PA system came on, and Admiral Halsey said, now hear this, now hear this. This force is bound for Tokyo. And right away the decks exploded with lots of jubilance and so forth. After a while, it got kind of quiet, and people began to wonder, what have I gotten myself into?
Did Colonel Doolittle at this point again ask everyone if they wanted to go through with it? Did he give people a chance to say, no, I don't want to do it?
Initially, back at Eglin,
Right.
everybody was given the opportunity to say yes or no. And that began there. As we moved along, nobody backed out or changed their mind.
So you're steaming toward Japan, and there was concern that the Japanese would see the aircraft carrier with the airplanes. How concerned was the colonel and all of you that you would be detected?
Well, he was pretty concerned, but I don't. He didn't come off that way. It was business as usual.
Right. But at one point, the Hornet you were detected,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so what happened?
Well, the Japanese had installed long-range radios in all their fishing boats and set up a network, a picket network out, and we ran along we were picked up at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were able to avoid that one. But the next one we couldn't avoid. And Admiral Halsey decided it was time to do something, so he ordered it to sink it. And the Nashville sunk it. But according to later, we didn't know this, they had sent a message back to Tokyo that they had seen 2 carriers. And they did take, I forget how many prisoners, 1 or 2 from the Tina Maru, the Japanese ship.
So the decision was made to launch early, yes?
Yeah.
How
Well,
concerned, how much farther away from Japan were you when you launched?
According to the Navy log, we were about 750 miles. The people back in Tokyo decided they wanted to wait for confirmation. And it wasn't going to come because the ship was sunk.
So when you launched, how much farther did you have to fly than you expected to fly?
I'd say about 300 miles. The Navy said they would try to take us in within 400 or 500 miles.
So how concerned were all of you about fuel?
Well, fuel became one of the prominent objects, but what could you do about it? So Colonel Doolittle decided to press on, and that's what happened.
So describe the mission. What was it like? What happened?
As we took off, the Navy held up a heads-up board as we passed. We circled. We couldn't fly except singly because you used up too much gas trying to wait for the other airplane.
For a join-up, yep.
We took off, and at that point, I was a little concerned, and I looked down and thought, well, we have just separated ourselves from civilization, because the only radio we had was the command radio, which had a frequency or a mileage of about 40 miles. And once that radio went bad, we were separated from everything. If the worst thing would have happened, there would have been 16 B-25s all over that part of the Pacific with no way to get together or nothing. And that would have really been a big problem.
So how many of the 16 aircraft were actually able to bomb their targets?
All of them, as far as I know, all of them bombed their target. The one that Ski York was flying had a exorbitant gas consumption. He was able to drop his bomb and go to Vladivostok and land wheels down.
Wow. And what was your target?
Our target was the whole northwest part of Tokyo, because we had nothing but incendiary bombs.
And you were accurate and dropped your incendiaries where they were supposed to go?
Yes, sir. On board the carrier, Fred Bramer, the bomber pilot, or bombardier, had, along with Colonel Doolittle, had picked out a place that he thought was pretty prominent, that he could use that as an aiming point. And when that time came, as we cruised into Japan and over Tokyo, he took over the airplane and dropped the bombs. And in the meantime, Colonel Doolittle had pulled up to 1,500 feet. And we made the run. At the end of the run, we started to get ack-ack, which wasn't accurate. And we went right back down on the deck. And between it and the end of the flight, we flew at about 200 feet. A big surprise was that when they took out the bomb sight, they took away part of the autopilot. And so it would work part of the time, and it didn't work for part of the time. So it was manhandle.
So you're heading to China, right?
Yes.
You have a field that you're supposed to land on in China.
Yeah.
What was the weather after you dropped your bombs in Tokyo? What was the weather on the way to China?
On the way to China, the weather was good. As we arrived over the Chinese coast, we had to go on an instrument because of the big warm front that was over China. So we climbed up to 9,000 feet and picked up the heading that Hank Potter, the navigator, had given us. And Colonel Doolittle said that he tried to call the base.
Where you were supposed to land?
Yeah. And in the meantime, that airplane that was carrying the mobile Homer crashed on the way there. So we had no home. We had no form of navigation. And the Chinese, on hearing our engines, thought we were Japanese, so they turned out all the lights.
So you couldn't land.
No. So we flew until we were getting close to running out of gas at 9,000 feet on the heading that Hank had given. And it turned out to be a good heading. Yeah. Yeah.
So what was the bailout process like?
Well, when the time came to bail out, we still had a little fuel. The tail gunner, Paul Leonard, the crew chief gunner, bailed out first. And then he was followed by the bombardier and Hank Potter. And then I went out, and Colonel Doolittle was last.
That was dark, right?
Yeah.
Night?
Dark, rainy, windy, just about everything you'd want if you were a farmer. But,
Everything you don't want when you're bailing out of an airplane.
and,
So where did you land in your parachute?
in the meantime, we had drifted north over a small range of mountains, so we never got close to where we were supposed to land. But on bailout, to go back a little bit, I think I was the only one on the whole group that had selected. Colonel Doolittle gave us the choice of the chutes, chest pack or backpack or seat pack. And I was kind of cheated from my other nature as far as buns were concerned. I chose the one with the big foam rubber chute. And I bailed out that way.
So where did you land?
I had the luck of my chute drifting over a pine tree. I never hit the ground. But on the bailout, I pulled the ripcord so hard, I gave myself a black eye.
Understood. Have you ever bailed out of a plane, Jim?
No, sir.
You haven't?
Been on fire a bunch of times. We've never had a bailout.
Oh, man. But you were determined that chute was going to open, right?
Oh, well, keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah. So you landed in a pine tree.
Yes.
So how long did you stay in the pine tree?
I spent the night in the tree. I was able to pull my chute in enough so that my legs wouldn't get tired just sitting on the limbs. It was like a half-seat affair. And I had a flashlight I couldn't see because of the fog. But so I know I didn't sleep, but I dozed off. But, the next morning, they had broken up quite a bit. I could see where, and I was able to climb down and repack my chute into a backpack and start walking west. We all had compasses, and we're told if we land is walk west. So I walked all day. Saw 2 students and a woodcutter. At night, just about dusk, I came out on a cliff that had a semi-military look, and there was a little Chinese shoulder accosted me and took me to a building. On the building was a chair and a table, and on the table was a piece of paper with a sketch of a 2-tailed airplane, 5 parachutes coming out of it. And I finally got him to take me where he took the guy that drew the picture. And we walked into this building that was being illuminated by candles, and it was overcast. And when I walked in, I could sense a person, or thought it was a person, off on my right. And in the meantime, they brought a bigger light thing in, and it was Colonel Doolittle. And I said, "Boy, am I glad to see you." And he greeted me and said, "I'm happy you're not hurt," and so forth.
What about the other three in the crew?
Well, a little bit later, they brought in Hank Potter and Fred Bramer, and Paul Leonard was picked up also. But in the meantime, for Hank and Paul, Paul was with him, and Fred Bramer, they had been picked up by some Chinese banditos, and they took their watches and their guns, and they were taking them someplace, but they didn't know where. But in the meantime, they ran into some loyal Chinese people. They took care of the banditos and brought them to the place where we were.
Did you ever think you were going to have an episode with banditos in China? Boy. So you were there safely.
Yeah.
How many of the other crew survived? Of the 80 crew members, how many of the 80 survived the day and the night?
I truly don't remember. I know that one man was lost on bailout.
Right. John?
And then didn't two drown? Two
Yeah.
drowned when they did,
Yeah,
so
two
3 died
drowned.
that night. Yes.
But when the war was over, how many of the 80 survived the war?
Yeah, 7 died as a direct result of the war. 3 that night, and then out of the 8 captured by the Japanese, 3 were executed by firing squad, and 1 was basically starved to death.
Right.
So that's the direct result of the war, of the raid itself. But then I think 2 crews. Yeah, I said 2 crews died flying the hump.
Flying the hump. Mm-hmm. That was after.
Yeah.
So, Jonna, when you've of course written about all this and know the details completely of all of this, when you think back about your grandfather, how much at what point were you aware of who your grandfather was and what he had accomplished?
Well, I think Jimmy would agree with this. You knew that he was well known. You knew that he'd made an impact, but he was just Gramps. You know, he was the guy that played with us and joked with us. So you didn't associate him with all these accomplishments until you were older.
He was simply a wonderful, loving family man.
Yeah.
Wow. And your grandmother, I mean, it seems difficult to talk about your grandfather without talking about your grandmother, right, Jim?
Yes, sir.
Huh?
Yes, sir.
What was she like?
Grand lady. Absolutely grand lady.
Wow.
The kind of person who did the right thing without even thinking about it. It just was her nature.
You know, as much as your grandfather, it seems like from the time he was a kid, was always living on the edge. He was no, right? He was no shrinking violet at all, and always living on the edge. How did your grandmother deal with that comfortably?
She was the rudder.
Huh?
Jimmy, she was the rudder.
Yep.
She was, he could have been a professional boxer, but she was that rudder. She was the one who
She was the stability augmentation.
That's true. Let's call it that.
That's what you need. That's what you need with difficult airplanes, and she was the stability augmentation.
She gave him the nest to come back to.
Right.
You know, she gave him. He could go off and do what he needed to do, and she provided that nest to come home to. Right? You knew Granny. You knew my grandmother, Mama Joe. What was Granny like?
She's I don't think there's enough of the adjectives to describe her. He was lost without her.
Wow. How much did you get to see, when he became General Doolittle, how much did you get to see him after the war was over?
About every reunion.
Right?
That was it.
When, after you were able to go back to the airplane and see it after you bailed out, what did Colonel Doolittle think he had done or not done? How did he feel about the raid and whether or not it was successful or not?
Well, these aren't my words. These are Paul Leonard's words. That the Chinese would only take 2 people up to the higher part of the mountain where the airplane hit. And so he chose to take Paul. And we had to wait till they got back. But after they got to the site, he said at one time that the colonel went over and sat down on a piece of the wing. And he was very dejected because, number one, he thought he had lost well, he knew he'd lost all the airplane, but he was going to get court-martialed, having lost all the airplane. And he didn't know. At one time, he was maybe a little confused about the success of the mission. And we all thought it was great. We had done what they asked us to do. And this is where Paul Leonard came into the scene, as he says, well, Colonel, they're not going to court-martial. They're going to promote you to a general and give you the Congressional Medal of Honor. And when you look at the pictures where Colonel Doolittle was sitting on the wing, he was very, very down at that time.
So they flew him back to Washington, right, Jana? And then they called your grandmother.
Yes.
So tell us that story about the next couple of days.
Well, General Arnold was a good friend of my grandparents, and he called my grandmother, who was on the West Coast at the time, and said, Joe, we need you to come to D.C. And she said, okay, I'll come tomorrow. He said, no, we need you to come tonight. So airliners at that time weren't really equipped for women, and she hopped on a flight and flew back, and they landed, I believe at Andrews, but I'm not quite sure. And she said she needed to run into the facility for just a minute, and they said, I'm sorry, there was a staff car waiting. I'm sorry, they're waiting for you at the White House. So she gets in the staff car, they go to the White House, she gets to the president's office, and she asks his secretary, may I make a quick stop? And his secretary said, I'm sorry, the president is waiting. So that pained look on her face instead of a smile was hours of no relief.
But then the Oval Office, right?
Yep.
Used Medal of Honor.
Medal of Honor. You know, Granddad didn't believe that he had earned it, and he thought it cheapened the medal to give it for something like the raid. So he had quite a discussion with General Arnold and General Marshall, and they outranked him, so he was awarded the medal. So when he accepted it from the president, he accepted it on behalf of all of his men, because he didn't do anything that Dick Cole didn't do. So that medal that's at the University of Texas in Dallas, not on eBay, it's actually in Dallas, belongs to this gentleman as much as it did to my grandfather.
Wow. Dick, it is an honor to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you, sir. And John, Jimmy, thank you both as always.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Cole, I hope you enjoyed that. I was, a round of applause for Colonel Cole. Was that cool or what? So look at this crowd. And thankfully, the rain will hold off here. We're going to bring Colonel Cole out in just a few minutes. But while we're waiting on them to get the mic off of him and all the things they need to do in there, I would like to ask Larry to tell us a little bit about the planning to get all of these B-25s here, a little bit about your airplane. Play like I'm an elementary kid, school kid who comes to your museum, telling me the questions they most often ask about your airplane.
Okay, I've always said that I am so blessed to be part of the community of B-25 owners and operators, because there's not a whole bunch of egos in this group of guys. It's a group of guys that are truly dedicated to what we do with these airplanes, preserving the history. So when we put out the word to do different events representing the Doolittle Raiders, where it'd be an event at the Air Force Museum, for instance, for one of the reunions or the gold medal ceremony or the final toast, or events like this at Oshkosh as be focused around the Doolittle Raiders, it's pretty much the same kind of importance to the mission that the Raiders felt, and many other airmen of World War II. They just want to know where, when, what, and of course Chris Henry and Connie and I, we just spent a lot of time on email and phone calls and seeing who could come and who was broke, who had an engine change coming up or who could make it. And B-25s are expensive airplanes to operate, and we've got airplanes here from Texas, from Long Island, New York, from all over the United States. People come here because they wanted to be part of this. They wanted to say that I was there and I participated in that. So it's just a huge honor to be part of the owners and that own these airplanes.
Tell me about this airplane behind me. It is a B-25. What's the fuel burn? What's the range for you guys versus what the Doolittle Raiders did?
Well, most of us are only using the main inboard tanks, and so we're about 5 hours range. And what the range is according to how far forward you push the throttles and how thick your wallet is. At economy cruise, you're burning about 125 gallons an hour, and most of you probably know what avgas goes for right now. And you're also burning 3 or 4 gallons of oil at the same time. These engines all consume oil. But the B-25 was developed actually before World War II, as you know. The 17th Bomb Group was already flying the B-model B-25s. And it was developed to be a medium altitude bomber, but later in the war, as you see all the package guns that's been added and all the other guns, it developed more into a role very similar to what the A-10 is today. It's close air support and ground support, especially in the Pacific, where it really shined. But the B-25 has a unique distinction. Of all the combat-equipped airplanes of World War II, is the only airplane that was in service from the beginning of the war to the end of the war, used by all the Allied air forces in every major conflict of the war. European War, Pacific War, Africa, it was used everywhere from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. One of the reasons why, it's easy to fly. You could take a young man right out of advanced pilot training, take him to an advanced field, he'd learn his combat skills with his bombardiers, navigator, which is what this airplane was at. This airframe you're looking at, what it was used for during World War II, it was used in a training command. So a pilot who had just got his wings, a bombardier who got his wings, the gunners who had just got their ratings, they had all come together at a transition base. They would be assigned a combat-equipped airplane, and then they would go out, strafe, bomb. They would learn their combat skills to be able to operate as a team. And then they would be transferred out as a replacement crew. And then another crew would get the airplane, and it kept getting repeated. And that's what this airplane was actually used for during World War II.
Colonel Cole, would you like to say anything to all these wonderful people who sat out here and watched you on the Jumbotron?
I'm sorry.
Would you like to say anything to the audience?
Yeah. I want you to know that the Raiders really appreciate your loyalty over the years. And we thank you in their word. Again, thank you for being here today and having fun.
And thank you all. What a wonderful crowd. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you once again on behalf of the EA Warbirds of America and me personally for all being here. Thank you.